It's Tuesday, September 8th, 2015, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today we're joined by one of our mentors, Marc Wendell, Director of Product Management at WorldNow, and he's going to be leading a talk on user experience, design tactics for product managers. So let me just briefly describe the format. We might be joined later by other mentors and mentees in the program. As they come in, as they join us, you'll see their little heads pop up along the bottom of the screen. And those are mentors and mentees within the Product Mentor program. The Product Mentor program is a program where we work to pair up mentors and mentees in the field of product management for a period of 6 months to help mentees, help people really move their product management careers forward, or even maybe just get them started. And today Marc is one of those mentors, and he'll be leading today's talk. So let me just, for those, if you have questions, we definitely encourage questions. To post your questions, and I'll get them to Marc in nearly real time. Just go to theproductmentor.com/live. And as they come in, I'll jump in and pass them along to Marc. I think with that said, Marc, I think we'll just jump right into it today. And as the questions come in, I'll be moderating them and feeding them over to you. And just for the record, for those of you who might not know, I'm Jeremy Horn, aka the Product Guy. I run this Product Mentor organization, as well as several other things, like most notably the product group from whence this came. But with that said, Marc, let me hand it over to you now to maybe do a little quick introduction of yourself and jump right into the talk.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So my name is Marc Wendell. I'm Director of Product at WorldNow and also a mentor at this session of the Product Mentor. And I'm also a former UX designer. So
hey, Marc, I love my face, but all I see is my face. Oh, there you go. There we go.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think my connection might be a little choppy. Anyhow, so yes, I am a former UX designer, currently Director of Product at WorldNow, which is a media software as a service provider. We power the digital solutions for a number of different media verticals. And I want to start by just just sort of putting some definitions in place and framing the discussion a little bit, because something that's interesting about user experience and other design topics is that they're attached to a lot of strong opinions. So just to make sure that we have sort of a nice framed discussion here, I want to talk a little bit about user experience, some tactics, some concepts that I think could be very useful for product managers. Specifically, most of this talk is going to come from experiences I've had in my own product management career, and I'm going to focus on some specific tools that I've sort of kept in my overall toolkit that have been very useful for me. But I'm going to be sort of speaking about user experience through the lens of the user-centered design process. And that graph right below the presentation there is sort of a loose interpretation of the user-centered design process. But basically, this is an approach to design where user behaviors are observed through a number of different inputs, and user needs are sort of defined and validated. And then they're turned into concepts that are tested in the market, brought to market, and consistently and quickly iterated on. And the iteration process is something I'm going to talk in a bit more depth about, because I think that is one crossover from user experience design that can lend itself quite nicely to the discipline of product management. And the reason I wanted to talk to you about this, I'm just sort of sharing a few quotes, is that, in essence, every sort of user-facing product, the very essence of success in user-facing products is solving a problem for a specific user. And these are just a couple of quotes that I've pulled sort of out of my Rolodex because, I think they were sort of interesting and inspirational. But I think it does sort of help highlight that sort of nexus of user experience and product management. One, of course, is from the great Tim Cook. The other one is also from the CEO of Box. And this is always one that I've sort of believed in, is that if you're improving upon the user experience, if you're making things better, making things simpler, addressing a problem more effectively, that will always sort of beat out speed and other factors that affect the product development process. And I think, I would also argue that, there's lots of discussion about toolkits and what's useful for product managers to sort of know from other disciplines. Is it marketing? Is it technology, coding, data science, design? I like to argue that, design in and of itself has probably the most, I dare say, tools that can be harvested into any Product Manager's Toolkit. So to set the stage a little bit about some of the more concrete items we're going to discuss, I'm going to walk through a couple of just sort of broad concepts that designers use in order to sort of shape sort of the ratio of problem to solution. And I'm going to talk a little bit about just some very, very concrete tools and tactics that anyone can use, again, in their own product development careers. But what I'm not going to get into is sort of any kind of design theology or dogma. And we could very easily spend a whole session talking through sort of the contemporary history of different design topics, design philosophies, paradigms, picking them apart, seeing how they sort of connect to the real world. But we're not going to do that today. I'm not going to get into the actual sort of theology of design. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my transition from sort of, I guess, what I would call my foundations in product and also UX, and how I sort of came to where I am today, because I think that's generally sort of relevant to the discussion. And I've had sort of an interesting journey, but originally my plan was to become a neuroscientist, and I did an undergraduate degree in psychology and quickly sort of pivoted toward human-computer interaction, which is one of the disciplines that contributes a lot into sort of contemporary design and the concepts of human factors and the user-centered design process I just mentioned. But I had the opportunity to work as a business analyst, and I was working as a business analyst at Columbia University, and it was a very different sort of experience than anything I've had to date, because there wasn't any real revenue involved or any sort of significant product benchmarks or anything like that. I was in a specific university department, and what we had to do was increase performance. And they didn't really have product managers, which might not be a surprise. They didn't really have a design team, which might not be a surprise. So I was sort of thrust into that and quickly discovered that what I was doing was user experience. So I had the opportunity to be I had the opportunity to take some formal training while I was in that first position, and that really springboarded me into my first user experience position, which was as a staff user experience designer at a small boutique agency here in New York. And while I was there, this particular agency didn't have any particular specialty. It was a generalist agency, and I got to do all sorts of different things. So I was wireframing, concepting, working with clients, doing surveys. So it was really sort of a real world sort of battleground for me, and I really started to get interested more in the analytical side of design. So working with users, doing user research, A/B testing, stuff like that. And then I worked at a company right after that, again joining sort of the global user-centered design group that was a scientific publisher called Elsevier. And I was quickly sort of loaned to the product team. And one of the reasons I was loaned was that we were working on a new product concept that was very, very different for Elsevier. And again, going back to that that original slide about the user-centered design process, they needed to move very, very quickly. And they needed to iterate a lot quicker than they were used to iterating. So that was sort of the nice dovetail for me in formally sort of joining the product management discipline. That was the most useful sort of training I had to bring it in to the product development discipline, was that sort of comfort with making observations, building products that are iterative, that that really weren't so concrete that it would take a long time to sort of do new releases or iterate or anything like that. But that served as a differentiator through to my position now as a director of product, and now in my director capacity, using those best practices from all the different disciplines, including design, has been something that's been a bit of a focus for me. So a couple of the concepts I'm going to talk you through tonight are context. And that's essentially the question of what is unique about the environment in which you're solving your problem, right? there's always patterns, there's always best practices that sort of carry across different user experiences, but it's really what makes each scenario novel that's important. The other one is simplicity, and this is something that is a very easy term to use. It's used in all sorts of different scenarios in business, technology, and everything, but that drive to really practice simplicity and limit complexity is what I think is worth, again, borrowing from the design discipline and practicing in product management. And I think the most important one on this list is empathy, right? And that's a real appreciation for what your user is trying to accomplish from start to finish within your product. So digging right into context, I included that that bubble diagram in the upper right, for a reason. There's, if you look on LinkedIn or you've been paying attention to any sort of like reading Fast Company or anything like that, there's lots of visualizations that overlay different bubbles like that to show sort of the intersection point of different concepts. But I found that context is often in that bubble. And again, if this were a design conversation, it might be context, content, and the user, and sort of the nexus between those three things being important. But in general, I try to think about context quite a bit. So World Now right now, we work with local media subscribers, right? And these are people all throughout the country that tend to consume breaking news through their local media outlets. And what makes it interesting is that breaking news tends to have a very, very short shelf life, right? So this could be weather-related, traffic-related, but it's content that is by nature not evergreen content. So a lot of the paradigms when it comes to sort of general media consumption and product management don't necessarily apply to me, right? Because I'm dealing with a user that's in a slightly different context, in a slightly different market. Again, we're talking about folks who tend to live outside of cities or more rural areas that are not looking at the New York Times or the Tribune, or accessing their media content from anywhere else but their local media subscribers. And the buyers that actually purchase the World Now services are these media groups that may or may not have any real connection with their user, right? So that's another sort of context that makes things slightly different for us in the fact that because it's sort of this B2B2C scenario, we have to sort of advocate on behalf of the consumer as well as our buyers. And that creates some interesting constraints for us because, breaking news, for instance, because the shelf life is so low, there's a lot of incentive on the buyers to increase social sharing constantly, right? So that leads to a lot of prescription on the customer side to constantly put social share buttons all over the place. But there are often times when this really competes with the user experience, and as product people, again, using sort of the sort of contextual inquiry method, we can find the right balance between what the buyer expectations are, what the consumer expectations are, and what we can iterate on most quickly. But in general, asking yourself that question and making sure you're answering it sort of honestly will avoid confirmation bias, which is a psychological phenomenon where when you're looking at data or you're looking at evidence, you're looking at different input, you tend to stop when you find the piece of data or the hook that confirms your suspicion, right? But it's not an objective sort of analysis. So asking yourself these questions about context can be very, very helpful.
So I just want to jump in there just very quickly.
Sure.
Those of you who are joining us now, and I see we've got a good number of people watching us live, definitely feel free to jump in with your questions. You just go to theproductmentor.com/live, and as the questions come in, I will pass them along to Mark here, and he will answer them as you guys send them. Thanks, and let me hand it right back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Jeremy. So the second broad concept I'm going to talk about is simplicity. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Mark Twain up top, is that a classic is a book which is praised and never read, and I really feel like simplicity sort of falls into that same sort of category. But a couple of examples of simplicity that I really like are, number one, just the wall socket. If you think of just the tremendous amount of complexity behind a wall socket, and the user experience is very, very simple. You take a standard socket, plug it into a standard wall. It's been like that for years and years and years. The other one too is just alternative weather. If you look down there, I love it. It's fucking raining right now. What more do you need to know? But some applications and some thoughts around sort of the practice of simplicity is completely different because, again, we're product managers, we have stakeholders, there are a lot of people who have input on the overall process, but a couple of ways that I've been able to sort of argue in advocacy for simplicity is to always make the argument that complexity costs more, right? So whether it's complexity in the user experience, right, that's going to impact conversion or impact, the acquisition of new users, especially if you're talking about scenarios like first-time user experiences and when you're actually presenting products to users for the first time, that is not the place for complexity, and it's always very useful to make that argument for simplicity when complexity is very costly. The other thing is think of complexity in the context of how you're going to iterate. If you have a product roadmap that's aggressive, or again, if it's a new product launch and you have to be ready to sort of respond to whatever the market response is to your product, that complexity is going to be a barrier to your ability to iterate on that product overall. And in general, you want to think about taking things away. That's, this is something that, Apple designers talk about all the time is, how do we get design out of the way? But, I think it's a good gut check to yourself to say, when have we taken away too much, right? And to me, that's sort of a more rational simplification of the problem is thinking, at what point if we take something away, are we really going to be costing the user experience something? And that's something that's helped me in a lot of different ways in my career. Another one is, again, another fairly nebulous concept, but the minimum viable product. Again, another great topic for this particular group. But keeping that concept of simplicity from sort of my design background has really helped me be more comfortable with the idea of the M in minimum viable product, because in my mind it's always what solves the problem, not what solves our stakeholders' demands or meets our assumptions, etc. It's what solves the problem. So again, that's another exercise, when you're caught sort of in these process definition sort of phases, MVP definition, stakeholder management, is to think about simplicity as a tool.
So I'm going to jump in right there. We've got a question from Anthony in the room. So as you switch back to video, I'm going to hand it over to Anthony to ask his question.
Hello, Anthony.
Hey, so I think when dealing with stakeholders, I found that after enough prodding, people can generally accept the concept that complexity does cost more. However, I find that business decisions aren't made, or they're not made when something costs more, but rather when the benefit outweighs the cost, right? So let's say a client has this one-off custom feature that they want to implement, and they're willing to pay X amount of dollars. And the question isn't, okay, well, adding this one thing that's not in our core product platform costs more or is more complex, but that, okay, well, how much are they willing to pay? And I find that the real question is what are the costs, what are the costs in the long run, and how can you boil that down concretely when dealing with these stakeholders in a way that can help better assess the costs appropriately?
Yeah, no, and hey, that's product for you, right? Everyone has stakeholders. Everyone has these one-offs you have to deal with. That's always going to be sort of pressure, in your product career. But think of complexity just sort of as a function of opportunity cost, and that's a great way to go back to your competitor. So opportunity cost is the concept of what aren't you doing because you're doing something else, right? So even if it's something that might be simple from a delivery standpoint, if it creates complexity in other places, right, then you're sort of taking something away from the rest of the from the rest of the pool. Now, at WorldNow, we come across this quite a bit because we're a software as a service provider. We have sort of a base platform, but we also have a rather robust professional services track where we do create bespoke features and other things for our customers. So something I've always been successful with is to separate those roadmaps out to the greatest extent possible. Taking that one step further, I also, kind of on the platform side of things, have always made sure that the platform or whatever, and again, I'm speaking more from the SaaS context, can support that without disrupting the rest of the platform, the rest of the product suite, the rest of your customers.
The approach that you described, do you end up having separate development teams then for your core platform and your professional services side, or are they still shared development resource?
I think it depends. We do, but invariably there's some horse trading between the development teams. But again, that's another complexity that can have an impact that you can take to your stakeholders. Saying this increases our complexity on the resourcing side because it's coming out of the core dev team rather than the professional services team, or if it's sort of moving in the other direction and putting undue pressure on the professional services team. That's another conversation that could be had.
Thanks.
Sure.
Great. So we've got one more question from someone who chooses to remain anonymous. And it might just be more of an add-on to some of what you've already been saying, but Anonymous is asking, how do you balance the stakeholder and the goal that the user is trying to accomplish?
So without the user, there are no stakeholders, right? Because users are the ones that generate the revenue through the use of the product. So, I think any sort of advocacy for the user, that's sort of the thesis of my whole talk, is that as long as you're solving a problem for a user, you'll figure everything else out. And again, there's been that's something that Apple has said, and many others have sort of very flippantly and sort of easily said, well, focus on the user and everything else will work out. I think there's a nugget of truth to that. Obviously life isn't that simple. You're always going to have to deal with budgets. You're always going to have to deal with stakeholders, customer renewals, meeting new market challenges. But if that becomes just something that you dedicate yourself to as much as possible, I think that could be profoundly helpful.
Cool. And there's some other questions in there. The more general questions I'm going to pass along to you, Mark, towards the end of the talk.
Okay.
But also, Patrick's got a question, but I'm going to get to Patrick's question. I think it'll be more appropriate in just a few slides. So I'm going to layer Patrick's in then. But with all that said, as people have questions, just post them to theproductmentor.com/live, and I will pass them on to Mark. With that said, Mark, take it away.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, so the third general concept we're going to talk about is empathy, and I'm going to give you a couple of concrete, examples to talk you through this. But empathy is, again, just a general appreciation and understanding and acknowledgement of the emotions that go into sort of the user experience process and the journey that your user takes. Now, this is something that's often wrote off. It's like, well, there's no room for empathy in business, and it's something that's seen as very soft and something I hesitate to say, but something that comes off very designy. But in general, that sort of relationship, that emotional relationship that is made with your user becomes the basis for the adoption and the retention of that user. So, and I think it sort of dovetails nicely when talking about stakeholder expectations versus user expectations. That fundamental empathy is really important to sort of balancing both, because if you're empathetic to that user experience, then the user is going to be successful, your stakeholders will be happy, and that process needs to sort of iterate on and on. But if you look at the one great example of empathy is sort of when designing for accessibility. Because again, I think that's something that that's overlooked in a couple of different ways. Whether you're sort of meeting the right front-end web standards to meet the screen reader sort of requirements, something that's like often overlooked. But if you look at that app in the lower right, that's an app that can that uses machine learning in order to detect sign language, and it's something that can actually be used to translate sign language into voice. Right, so this is, for the deaf community, when they actually have to speak to someone who, they essentially kind of have to relay sign language back to voice. And in this regard, it's very, very important to be empathetic to this community, because this is something they're actually depending on, right? So this isn't something that's a value add to your life. This is something that is a very, very important assistive technology. But, that sort of spectrum of the assistive technologies all the way to sort of the non-assistive technologies, empathy sort of plays a role in all of this. So again, it's something that if when you need to baseline yourself and understand who am I doing this for, doing that through the lens of empathy can be very, very helpful. So now I'm gonna switch gears a little bit, and we're gonna talk a little bit more on the about the tactical sort of day-to-day sort of tools from the design discipline that can help sort of the PM mission. One is workflow analysis, and that's essentially understanding sort of the end-to-end process that users take when they when they onboard to your product for the very first time, all the way through sort of their adoption cycle. The other one is user research, just a couple of good methods that you can use, again, in order to generate data, right, and rather than opinions, to iterate on your product. And the third one is just general concepting. So this is wireframe, illustration, what have you. But what I think these tools can do for you is really help you tell the story you need to tell from a day-to-day standpoint, because design is essentially a storytelling process. And Captain Obvious down there is telling you, like, well, of course you tell a story, but again, I think there's there are tools that we can borrow from design that'll help us tell better stories more effectively.
So I have a question that just came in, and this is from Skylar R. And Skylar is asking, how viable are behavioral consumer researchers, especially retail, in client goals for corporations that offer various solutions from reporting, trends, and software?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. From my standpoint, more on the B2B product side, I think it really depends on the context. See, using my design context skills there. But I've always found that when you're entering new markets, when you're addressing new customers, when there are very, very new trends, something that World Now is working very diligently on right now is over-the-top television, right? And over-the-top television just generically talks about the trend of consumers consuming consumer content like outside of their traditional media and cable bundles. So it's about content creators going right to their audience. Now this is something that's at a certain level of development. It's a trend that's been sort of slow boiling for years now, but it's just starting to become a viable alternate sort of delivery device for our customers. So there we do actually look at the industry trends, because those sort of broad brushstrokes that guys like Forrester and Gartner are going to paint, I think I think that can be very valuable. But I would say is make sure that it's one input, right? Don't rely 100% on a Forrester report and come in and say Forrester says it's going to be huge, we're going all in on it. Talk to your users, do your research. Again, analyze the individual context that that you're sort of operating in, and then sort of make your approach from there. On the some of the research I have been exposed to on the retail side, I'll say one comment is that's a very, very mature space, so there's lots and lots of data. So those can be very, very helpful again when you're talking about going into new market segments. Right now, something that I've been exposed to through consulting is lots of retailers moving into China, where they don't necessarily have a store in China, but there's lots of demand for their goods. And that retail market sort of analysis can be very, very helpful. But again, in terms of how you translate that into product input, it really should be cross-referenced with all your other research points.
Great, great. That's all the questions we have at the moment. But as I've said before, oh wait, one just came in. This one from another anonymous individual. Let's see, as I'm reading it right now. Wow, look at that. Okay, so a few just came in. If dealing with one product that supports multiple industries with very different practices, workflow analysis changes the time to market. What would be a useful tool to address this?
So I think workflow analysis is what will tell you whether or not it will address time to market. I think that's the sort of practice that you go through in order to understand what you're sort of looking at from a delivery standpoint, an execution standpoint, a roadmap standpoint. I think in terms of a tool, and what we're going to get into in just a moment, is making sort of the complexity of the workflow analysis visible to your stakeholders, understanding what you can do in order to streamline workflows so that you can reduce your time to market. But essentially, it's that practice of actually taking the time to analyze your workflow instead of saying, well, this is analogous to this. I think that's enough. We're comfortable. We're moving.
Great, Great. Yeah, that's all the questions we have right now. Keep them coming in at theproductmentor.com/live. And Mark, take it away.
Right. So talking a little bit about workflow analysis, here's a couple of questions that, again, I think can help sort of guide the analysis process. And without spending 45 minutes on each one of these tactics, which we can definitely do, trying to just keep this practical and talk about just a couple of sort of aces that I keep up my sleeve whenever we're sort of building new product, working with stakeholders in the road mapping process, the budgeting process. But essentially break down to the most discrete level possible. What are the steps that are actually being taken? And again, this is something that's very easy, something that can be taken for granted, very easily. Well, product's 5 years old, user base is essentially the same. I don't really have to revisit the workflow. But a lot of times there are surprises there, that can really exploit certain opportunities. For instance, I had an interesting sort of experience where, we wanted to use infinite scroll in certain places, but even with evergreen content, but that just doesn't work for users who are used to consuming breaking news content. It really didn't increase engagement or raise lift for us in any way. And then sort of look at these steps and wonder why there are that many steps, or wonder why there are so few steps. Look for bottlenecks, look for conflict, and things of that nature that can make it, that can affect the user experience. Also think about the dependencies. Again, that I love that quote from Tim Cook where he said, products are being designed more for self-interest and business models and user experience. Think about that sort of in the workflow process. And then just start taking things away. Think about what can be simplified. Again, in general, doing something better is always going to lead you in the right direction product-wise. And then something that really works for stakeholder management is how do you quantify the actual value of this simplification. So if I can say, well, we're taking this step out, and I think that that's going to reduce our barrier to entry to this much, or we think that users are going to be able to accomplish this task that's of X value to us, is something that, again, will give you sort of concrete input, in your sort of day-to-day role. And something that I've always used workflow analysis is, when you're up against this challenge, when we say, well, we should really change this, or we should really modernize this user experience, or we should get into this market, and you immediately get the pushback. It's like, but this is how we've always done it. It's not broke. Why would we change it? A workflow analysis can sort of surface, some of the reasons as to whether or not it's justified to actually work forward or to stick with what you have. So the second sort of tactic we're going to talk about is user research. And again, I think that of all the tactics we're going to talk about tonight, there's a lot of presuppositions when it comes to user research. There's the idea that it's costly, that it takes a long time, that it produces skewed results, and that it just creates work because then there's a lot more to analyze. But in general, too bad I don't have Captain Obvious on this slide too. All of your assumptions should be validated. And I love that. I wish I knew actually who this quote was attributable to, but if you're just going to go in sort of blind or based on your assumptions, you kind of have to be right. But one way to ensure you're right is to validate your assumptions every time. And a couple of easy sort of no tiers tactics you can use are surveys. And again, I probably send out one survey a month. For instance, right now at WorldNow, we are completely revamping the slideshow experience because that's something that generates a lot of engagement for our user groups. And instead of saying, okay, I've been working on this product for a while, I know the user really well, these are clearly the top 3 problems, we just put out a survey, right? That is going to help us sort of validate our assumptions about what the priority should be when it comes to this project. And again, it took all of a half a day to completely execute. Another thing is site interviews. A lot of our customers are here in New York. Typically users, if you reach out to 10 users and say, hey, I want to come by and visit you and just have a very informal discussion about either something we're working on or a problem that I know that we solve for you that I want to just sort of get level set on, It's usually much easier than you think, and again, it's more an investment of time than anything else. But literally, just semi-structured, informal interviews with your customers. And then there are online sort of automated tools like usertesting.com. And usertesting.com and usability tools actually has a lot of different tools other than just what usertesting.com focuses on. But what these companies do is, you can upload 2 versions of a design, or you can upload sort of a clickable prototype. There's lots of flexibility with the actual design that you present. But what these companies then do is they find your target user, or they find some sort of statistically significant sample, and then they present these ideas to your users, and you get feedback, and sometimes you can even get video of the user actually interacting with your product. And the feedback, the audiences for usertesting.com and usability tools are so big, sometimes within a number of hours, you'll get some really, really great feedback. So again, all of this stuff, it's not sort of biblical or anything like that. Just it's stuff that you can do very, very quickly, again, in order to validate assumptions. And this is something that we do a lot at World Now, because we have a lot of news people at World Now that feel that they really understand sort of the core use cases when it comes to breaking news. But as we know, these evolve over time, and this is a great way to capture sort of the essence of these evolutions.
So a whole bunch of questions that have come in. I want to go to Patrick Metzger's question first. And Patrick asks, as a semi-technical product manager, some coding background but not an engineer, what are some ways to learn, implement A/B tests at an organization not yet doing so?
That's a great question. Again, A/B testing is another tool you can use to generate data that validates assumptions, that creates insight, that teaches you more about your user, that makes it easy, allows you to spend development resources and money more effectively. So I think from an advocacy standpoint, those points are really important to make. But what's great is there's so many great, very lightweight tools out there like Kissmetrics and Optimizely that are inexpensive, and you can drop this code on a sample page. Pick up if you wanted to just frame up an experiment, to your stakeholders and say, I think that we can solve this problem X better, and I'm gonna prove this out using A/B testing. I think it'll be an easy conversation. And then take this code, find a page that everyone's comfortable with testing it on, and run an A/B test. See what you get, and just get the process started. In terms of experimentation and trying new tactics like this, I'm always all for it. You're going to learn a lot more by pushing these things than by sort of shying away or sort of taking the easy route or taking the political route. But I say, whenever you have the opportunity to experiment with anything that's going to develop new insight, it's always worth it.
Great. And a question from Krishna. What are your views on getting feedback from the focus groups? Any recommendations in the right way of doing these studies?
Sure. So focus groups can be very, very effective. And in general, in my experience, I tend to use focus groups, again, when we're very, very early in the process. I've used them in the past when it comes to new product development in brand new categories. And it also tends to be more about behavioral sort of validation, right? So do people of this demographic in this geography, really like Mr. Softy? Like, is that something is that even true? Is there's something that's sort of fundamental to your product thesis that is 100% an assumption, and it's not easy to sort of get at from sort of a conceptual level, a focus group could be very effective. Now, there are other psychological phenomena that you have to be aware of in focus groups, like groupthink and other sort of just best practices you have to follow in order to get the most out of your focus group. But again, in general, I think it's something from a product standpoint that works best earlier in the process. But again, I've worked with marketing teams that do it from that will use focus groups to sort of judge their markets on a grand scale rather than their products. So again, it's something that I don't think it has to be quite a big deal as some people make it, but best use it early in the process.
Okay. And we have another question from yet another anonymous individual. and they ask, what if the stakeholder thinks that the assumptions are done and they validate for each feature? Would it be worth going through the research process again?
So I think it's worth going through the research process again when you have a piece of data that would suggest otherwise, that the concepts are validated. Again, confirmation bias is something that is very common given the amount of data we have access to. So the thinking about it scientifically, right? It's like you look at all the inputs, all the data, and you draw a conclusion. But a lot of times what happens, especially in different stakeholder groups, is there's an opinion, and then you back your way into supporting that hypothesis, which is sort of the scientific process turned on its head. So I think if you're ever in that scenario, it's always worth redoing the research to make sure you're going out with a valid assumption.
Great. And the next question comes from someone who seemed to have had trouble typing in their actual name. And they have a very strong opinion, I think, layered into this question. So they ask, UX designers are often biased toward their own findings and designs. How do you, as a product manager / UX hybrid, make tough, unbiased decisions?
So I would actually argue that everyone's biased toward their own findings. That was kind of my point from the last, my last comment. But again, if you're really going to call yourself a UX designer or a hybrid UX product designer, it's all about the user, right? So again, reduce sort of the problem and the solution to what is the problem we're solving for the user, and then find sort of go out and test against that concept, not the other way around.
Great, great. So that's all the questions we have at the moment, but again, keep them coming in at theproductmentor.com/live. That said, back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Jeremy. So now we're moving on to concepting, and this is actually something from the user experience discipline that I think could be quite a bit of fun. But in general, I've always found when you're in the ideation process, or even when, let's say that this is actually where I think concepting can have a great impact, is when you sort of taken a concept out of the backlog, or you've inherited a concept that has been something that an organization has wanted to do for quite some time, but they've never sort of gotten there. Typically speaking, in the general sense of the product development process, it's the idea is ideated, and the design team comes in, and then there's some wireframes done, and then everyone signs off on the wireframes, and then some comps get done, and then everyone signs off on those, and then you start going into the requirements process. I say you start that wireframing process as soon as you can. And when I say wireframing, again, I'm not talking about super sort of detailed, very, very pixel perfect sort of wireframing, but literally using some of the tools sort of along the bottom edge here. Lower fidelity wireframes, there's other interesting phenomena, but certainly other sort of scenarios that have been encountered in other product managers' lives where, if you present a concept, right, that hasn't really been bought in on or funded or approved yet, with comps that look pixel perfect to, what your product looks like today, in some organizations that can come with the presupposition that you've already made all the decisions that got you there, right, and that you're sort of pushing this very, very baked concept onto someone, and sometimes it can provoke a response that sort of says, wait a second, is everybody on board with this? It can sort of kick the process back sort of a few steps. But if you find an opportunity and you say, well, and you start sort of answering those product questions, should we build this? When should we build this? What should we put toward this? Wireframe it out as soon as you can. Do something really, really quick. This is a wireframe using Balsamiq, which literally, the interface only spits out these visualizations that look like they were drawn on a whiteboard. So it's a great sort of step up. Another thing that basic sort of concepting and wireframing can do is just sort of speed up that design process. So if you come to design with sort of some basic wireframing and saying, hey, this is where we're starting from, not sort of being prescriptive, but saying this is our starting point, then a lot of times you can really accelerate that ideation process. So, again, I'm just going to go back one slide. For Apple users, I think UX Pin and OmniGraffle, which is by the Omni Group, work really, really well. UXPin is actually web-based, but it works really, really well on Apple's particularly well. And then for any sort of diehard PC users out there, Axure is a really good tool, as well as Visio. You know, not to sort of hate on Microsoft or anything, but you know, these are just 4 tools that I've used in my day-to-day in order to build wireframes. And sort of on that topic, I just want to address the idea of collaboration with your design teams a little bit, because you know, especially when you're sort of approaching, you know, a design team with you know, with the wireframe, sometimes it can kind of be like, you know, cooking a meal for your chef and coming in and say, hey chef, eat this, it's the best meal you're ever going to have. You know, that's sort of not the point. But what I think that the process of, you know, building sort of this culture of rapid iteration, wireframing all the time, is that it will get people all sort of bought in on the product, on the process, and the fact that the user really should be everyone's responsibility, and everyone should be accountable toward, you know, building the best possible experience for your users. Because again, at the end of the day, that's what a lot of success is going to rest on. So in terms of, you know, should design own the relationship with the user, or should product own the relationship with the user, it's always best to take a step back and say, you know, this is a joint responsibility, and all of our collective input will move the needle more effectively. So for some sort of easy to get at resources, if anyone's interested in formal training in user experience, 2 great resources are General Assembly and Human Factors International. General Assembly, I'm assuming, doesn't need much introduction, but they have a great user experience program. Human Factors International is a bit more on the analytical side of user experience. Again, if you're interested in learning sort of enhanced user research techniques, enhanced user interviewing techniques, that's a great program, and I've been through the Human Factors training myself. And a couple of just general online resources just around the process, around just individual tactics, best practices, you know, trends in user research. UX Booth, Design CC, and UX Apprentice are great. UX Booth has a lot of different sort of content on the UX process. UX Apprentice really sort of buckets out the different aspects of UX design really nicely, again, if you're interested in understanding sort of the end-to-end process. So my takeaways for this chat is, you know, I think any product manager could benefit by having just a couple of basic user experience sort of tools in your toolkit. And again, it's nothing that has to be you know, sort of too polished or too religious, or you know, so aligned to UX best practices, but just having these couple of toolkits, tools in your toolkit can be very helpful. And you know, a great question to ask, again, when you're talking about ownership conflict, stakeholder conflict, or what you're doing is, you know, a great question I've heard a million designers just sort of step back and say is, what problem are we solving? You know, that gets it sort of back right to the root. And you know, I put these gears in here because this is, you know, one of the reasons I sort of made the formal transition from UX to product is, you know, UX is sort of one gear in a big machine, and product is really, you know, having an understanding and sort of a stake in all of the gears. But really the bottom line is when all the gears are greased and moving, you know, freely, the entire machine works better.
Great. I'm going to hand it over to Anthony right now, who has a question for you.
So this goes back to the discussion about wireframing. When you're doing the beginning wireframing, do you have an opinion on whose role you feel that job best falls to, whether it's product managers or UX designers? In other words, when we're coming to a discussion about, let's say, a new feature or product that we have ideas on, do we leave the initial ideation to the UX designer, or do we come ready to discuss with our own thoughts? And I guess what I'm getting at is that I don't know if it makes sense for me to kind of like come with an idea of how I think it should work or look, and I don't know if doing so would kind of pollute or at least frame and contextualize the thing such that you know, there can't be some like blue sky thinking around that.
I think it depends. I mean, by the way, again, that's another excellent question, Anthony. I think it depends on a couple of things. Number one, if you're talking about a very, very nebulous concept, rather, if you're talking about something that, you know, there's no real mental model for, or no one can really conceive, but something that is really, really important, having design involved early in the process is always a smart thing. However, if you're talking about really quick iteration, right, where you have to move really, really quickly, and you know, something that might be just sort of the next iteration on a design that, you know, the design team has already sort of laid out sort of officially, then I don't think any product manager should be afraid or hesitant to wireframe something up quickly, because it gives you a starting point. And I think in the right context, and a lot of this, you know, you'll have to feel out because different organizations have sort of different governance and different sort of political sort of norms. But what it can do to really speed up the ideation process is give you a place to start, right? So if the concept is really concrete, bring your design team together, bring your stakeholders together, and say this is the visual representation of where I think the starting point is.
Excellent, excellent. So that's all the questions we have tonight. And so I'd like to thank our speaker, Marc Wendell, Director of Product Management at WorldNow, for today's discussion on UX design tactics for product managers. And as always, and as I'm often frequently asked throughout this talk and before this talk, the presentation will be posted to our SlideShare channel, and I'll make that link available to everybody. And a big thank you from me, Jeremy Horn, the product guy, and to everyone else who joined us today, and the product mentor. And also don't forget, if you're interested in being a product mentor like Marc here today, to all sorts of product people, small company, large company, digital product, physical product, please visit theproductmentor.com and sign up to be a mentor. Our next session is session 4. It starts November 1st, and we're looking for a lot more mentors to work with our hundreds of mentees who are already currently signed up. And also, if you're looking to fill a new product job with a great product person, visit our very own free-for-all job board at theproductjobs.com. And with all that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye.
Thanks, Jeremy.